Well. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you throughout this great expanse called Earth to WCEG Talk Radio. We are the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak life into the community. Today is Monday, March 27th, 2023. Where she alive? This will be my mother's 104th birthday. You are tuned into Issues and Answers with your host, Norman A. Carter Jr. Me. Wow. See my name written down there? That's me. Our goal is to make you a little bit more informed than you were before you tuned in. Citizens of the world, this is definitely the new WCEG. There is a biblical warning about putting new wine into old bottles. That is not the case with us. We are featuring new content and new formatting. This means more people will find more to listen to and more ways to access than before. I'll explain that to you shortly. You may subscribe to us free on your YouTube channel by typing in WCEG Network. So easy. You may like or follow us and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. How about that? In addition, we have new platforms for access to our programming. You may download our free mobile apps for your cell phones by going to the Apple Store, and search for WCEG Talk Radio for iOS, Apple, iPhones, and iPads. On your Apple Watch, search WCEG Network. For your Android phones and tablets, go to the Google Play Store. Search for WCEG Talk Radio. Now, I want you to pay attention to this, especially today. The topics and opinions are those of the show host and guest, and not the WCEG network. So please leave my boss alone. I stand behind all that I say, and so do my guests. Thank you for your continued support. As always, I appreciate your accessing us via Facebook to text in your questions and comments. Ladies and gentlemen, today I had a text message. Well, I went on Facebook to one of my connections and also a host of our own programming here on WCEG, Reverend Diane Doherty. And she posted this inscription that came from the monument to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at his memorial in Washington, D.C. And it fits my presentation today. Pay attention. We must unscrupulously guard the civil rights and the civil liberties of all citizens, whatever their background. We must remember that any oppression, any injustice, any hatred is a wedge designed to attack our civilization. Do you get that? And before I do have a special guest, before I get into that, I just want to read this to you. If you have sore feet, this is a preamble to this program. If you have sore feet, this is not the program for you. I will be stepping on toes. Some of those toes are on the feet of racists. Some of those toes are on people who, through lack of knowledge, are unwittingly merchants of anti-Semitism. This program is designed to be your virtual good feet store. Those cloven shoes you have been wearing need to come off. Cloven shoes are incapable of taking you on a journey via the King's highway. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. James Weldon Johnson's final verse of Lift Every Voice and Sing finds itself abandoned by many who are too ashamed to sing this last and most important verse. When folks drunk with the wine of the world tell you to go back where you came from, you can proudly say, shadowed beneath God's hand, I will forever stand, true to my God, true to my native land, the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest in the waiting room. This is sort of a last minute arrival, but I do so much appreciate him, as we're going to be talking about Stone Mountain of Georgia this week. And there's a lot to unpack. So I know our program is normally an hour. We may run a little bit over because, as I said at the intro, this program is about making you a little bit more informed than you were from the beginning. And this is an important topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Mr. Richard Rose. Mr. Richard Rose is the president of the Atlanta branch of the NAACP. Mr. Rose, I am so honored to have you as our guest here on Issues and Answers.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to bring whatever I can to the discussion.
Oh, I'm sure you can bring a lot to this discussion. Mr. Rose, I think you have been in the forefront of a movement to rid us of that aberration called the carvings on the Stone Mountain at Stone Mountain. When did this start with you? And we'd like to know a little bit about your opinions on it.
So sure. So I have always understood for a number of years the negativity about Confederate monuments and Stone Mountain in particular. And so in 2015, I was installed as president of the Atlanta NAACP and took that opportunity to try to bring the issue to the forefront. White supremacy and racism, there's a psychology of racism. And these monuments are part of that psychology. It was never enough for whites to just say, we are supreme human beings. At the same time, they said, we are supreme and you are subhuman. The only two objectives to oppression, those are deprivation, to deprive you of your resources and the ability to gain resources, and degradation, which is to take away your self-worth. And these monuments are part of that second stream, which is degradation, by oppositely extolling those who fought, albeit unsuccessfully, to maintain the institution of slavery in America. Having started my first civil rights movement back in Memphis at the age of 13, it became clear to me that all of the gains that we've had, all of the progress, there's always been something there which continued to claim white supremacy, and those monuments, including Stone Mountain, are part and parcel of it. And just, I use a tactic of Dr. King by picking the biggest bully on the block and attacking him.
That's a big bully. That's a huge bully.
Yeah. And since then, we've seen movement across the country. DeKalb County was next, Memphis removed theirs, New Orleans removed theirs. And now the federal government is changing the names of military bases that have been named for Confederate leaders in general, including Lee and Pickett and Gordon and so forth. So it's catching on, not fast enough for me, but I am committed to the struggle.
President Rose, one of the things that I had in my preparation for this program, and one of the points that I think is ignored, is that far too many Americans think that this is a Black issue. It's an African American issue. And it goes far beyond that because, as you mentioned, those soldiers who died, they were so wrapped into keeping slavery as part of America that they were willing to destroy the United States in order to maintain that style of living. They were willing to tear down the government. And that's not hyperbole, because one of their fanatics actually killed the president of the United States.
That is true.
And so this is about actually tearing apart our country, not just slavery. And I think that's an important issue, and more people need to look at that.
Well, to prove your point, and just to emphasize it, this fixation with the Confederacy has created a stream of disloyalty, anti-patriotism that exists throughout this country. January 6th, 2021 is a prime example of that. There is a stream of people who are waiting to overtake and overthrow this country. And they have been encouraged by these subversive organizations, subversive activities, and these subversive statements. A monument is not history. A monument is a political statement, no matter who it depicts. If it's Jesus Christ, it's a religious theme, but it's a political statement. If it's Buddha, it's a political statement. If it's Dr. King, it is a political statement to say, we agree with what this person or this idea stands for. And so these monuments have actually put government in the racism business. And until we remove all of these political statements, even if they were made, in the case of Stone Mountain, it was attempted to be made 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. If the statement is still remaining, that's the message that is being sent, that's the message being received, and that's the message that is being reinforced throughout our society.
And the history of that mountain, the owner of that mountain, it was privately owned at one time, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, Mr. Venable.
Right.
It was purchased. Well, it became a campaign promise of Governor Marvin Griffin.
Right.
And he, right after the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case was lost by Topeka, Kansas, and won by Brown, and allowed for and stated that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. He made a speech 57 days later, basically a call to arms for the racists in Georgia and in the legislature, that he made a campaign promise to finish that mountain, to purchase that mountain, because it was in direct opposition to the federal mandate for integration. And a lot of people don't know that.
Right. Well, you got it right. Matter of fact, he said essentially, as long as he's governor, colored children would not sit in the classroom with white children. He
Yeah.
didn't care what the Supreme Court said. He said, because this is Georgia. And so his second legislative session in 1958, the state legislature agreed to buy Stone Mountain, the entirety of that property, which was a rock quarry.
Mhm.
And let's be clear, you know, people claim, the opposition likes to claim there's history, but there's no history about Stone Mountain other than that it's Ku Klux Klan relationship. You know, as you
Yeah.
said, Venable family, with at least two of the Venable families were grand wizards of the Ku Klux Klan. And they led it, and they had their annual meeting, cross burnings and so forth at Stone Mountain, which is why it was so important for Marvin Griffin. As I mentioned earlier, he was sending a political message we still got that message today.
And almost immediately after the mountain was completed, there was a ceremony at the top of the mountain by the KKK,
Right.
where they burned a cross at the top of the mountain. And this, if you can't grasp the fact that that is what that mountain is about, and that's what it represents, there's something wrong with you. And we still, our problem is that we still have legislators who support the law, and people don't realize this. There's a law that basically says, that I'm condensing it, that the Stone Mountain carvings has to be preserved into perpetuity.
Correct. Absolutely right. And in fact, there is a law introduced this term by State Representative Bill Mitchell and others from the DeKalb delegation, which will remove the memorial designation of Stone Mountain, which will allow other changes to Stone Mountain beyond. So if it's no longer memorial, then it doesn't have the protection to be maintained in perpetuity. I don't expect that will pass, but we have to continue our opposition to that symbol and other symbols. Silence gives consent.
Yes.
We must not be silent in the face of this mistreatment.
And you know, just as a side note, the park is actually a beautiful park. It's a beautiful park. It's just that emblem, and I was going to mention this later on in my presentation, but to give you the gist of what's going on, shortly after I moved to Georgia, I'm from Philadelphia originally. I went with a friend of mine to the laser show on July the 4th. Didn't know anything about Stone Mountain, had never been there, but the laser show was supposed to be so spectacular. And for our viewers and listeners, thousands of people, tens of thousands probably, go to that park on July the 4th for the laser show. So I was among them. But I found the laser show a little bit uncomfortable because it actually portrayed people I knew to be American traitors as heroes. And I found that a little unsettling, not to mention that 99% of the people there were Caucasian. So jumping up a few years, my church decided that they wanted to go to Stone Mountain to see the laser show. And I really didn't want to go, but the majority of our church wanted to go. I'm sort of a leader in the church, so I decided, okay, I would go along with them. So we went there early to get a seat on the grass lawn, huge grass lawn. Maybe about 20 feet away from us, there was a family, a white family of about 15, 20 people. And this young kid, he was 13 to 15, somewhere in there, he had made himself a whip. And he stood up, and after we had been there for about 15 minutes, he turned and faced us and started cracking that whip until his arm got tired. He sat down, got back up about 10 or 15 minutes later, did the same thing. This went on for about 3 times. It only stopped when a Stone Mountain Park police officer happened to be driving by and saw what he was doing and actually ran over to this kid and told him to put that whip down. But that whip was symbolic of how these people, these families viewed that they should treat Black people. And he was making a statement that obviously had been passed down to him from his parents, to the grandparents, that this was okay. And I found that unsettling, and I actually left because I got so angry that I would have said something. But
well, it's shamefully the attendance of Black people at these laser shows is an endorsement of white supremacy in itself.
yes,
It, what Dr. King said, a man can't ride your back unless it's bent.
yes,
And that's basically a bending of the back to say we accept that. And there are what three stages to oppression. The first stage is resistance, and we know the stories of Africans being in the middle classes, jumping off the ship, and otherwise, rebelling not to be taken into captivity. The second one is acknowledgement. Well, I'm on the ship. How can I escape? How can I get back to my family? Still related to resistance. But the third one, the next level, is acceptance, where you accept that this is normal. You heard the jokes about, how we feel the day boss, where the Black
right,
workers, say, hey, accepts that I am inferior. And of course, then the last level is complicity, where members of the oppressed class assist with the oppression in return for some modicum of benefit. And unfortunately, that's where we still are. I mean, we still have complicitors, as I call them. I coined that phrase, where they have not only have they accepted the supremacy, the supreme being, but they also are complicit in assisting with that oppression.
Yes, President Rose, with all due respect, back in my day, we used to call them handkerchief heads, but I don't think people use that term anymore. But yeah, you can't, the one thing I remember when I had been here just a few months, Governor Ross Barnes was governor, and he was fighting to get the Confederate emblem removed from his from the flag, the Georgia flag. And at a news conference, I saw this. They interviewed this Black man who was carrying the Confederate flag, and they asked him, why was he carrying it? And his answer was, because this is part of Southern heritage. This is part of who we are. Basically, that was his answer. And this goes back to, he's the guy that everybody says, well, look at him. Look at him. Donald Trump does the same thing, where he says, they're up in the stage, there's my African American.
Yep.
It's that same thing. So they take that one or those few and make those examples for all of us.
Right.
And thereby that becomes their justification for maintaining the status quo.
Right. And the defenders also deflect and conflate, and they actually outright lie. For example, I've had people to email me and say, well, it was 100,000, Robert E. Lee commanded 100,000 Black soldiers. Just nothing true about that. And in fact, the Confederate Congress in March passed a law passed a measure to recruit Black soldiers. But none were recruited because Robert E. Lee surrendered on April 9th, the same year. And in fact, a general out of Augusta wrote that if we accept Black soldiers, then our premise of superiority is down the drain. Because we said we are the spirit, but we got to get Black soldiers to save the Confederacy. What have we done? And so, there are all kind of stories like that about because they don't let the truth get in the way of them making their point.
And obviously, you realize that very point was true until midway through World War II, where bringing Black soldiers and putting them in combat with white soldiers was not done, and it took basically desperation, because we were losing so many troops, that somebody says, we need a little help. Why not let these people come in? Why not let these Japanese that we had in concentration camps? Why don't we get some of them to come fight with us? Why don't we let the Blacks come? And that's what happened with your military, which resulted in Truman actually integrating the services much later. But
right. Truman was might add the longtime executive director of the NAACP. Walter White was from Atlanta, a graduate of Atlanta University, and he started lobbying Roosevelt at first to integrate the armed services, but it didn't happen until Harry Truman was the president after Roosevelt had died.
Just simply amazing, simply amazing. I keep wanting to call you doctor. Well, Mr. Rose, I know that you had a tight schedule. I really appreciate your coming in and lending your expertise and your knowledge to our viewing audience. This was just a big treat for me.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. More notice would help, and I can't stay much longer. But I appreciate the call from Reverend Rogers.
Well, I think that, in fact, I'm sure, because I spoke with someone from the head of the Atlanta Historical Museum, and he wishes to come on and discuss this topic. So perhaps sometime in the near future, we can all get together and have a really huge discussion with more time on it.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue, I have to say that several nights ago, I don't know what you would say, I've suffered from insomnia, but many times I'm just up in the middle of the night. And several nights ago, I resisted and embraced from the arms of Morpheus, if you know who Morpheus is. And so I was scrolling through the television channels until I reached our local public broadcasting channel. And there before me was a young lady, a Temple University journalism student by the name of Genesis Reddix. She is a well-spoken African-American activist from Decatur, Georgia. This young person was talking about the impact of the carving on Stone Mountain in Georgia's DeKalb County. She was not only speaking of the impact of that massive carving, but also its symbolic hypocrisy. The veneration of that carving honoring men who led a movement to divide this country in order to maintain the inhumane practice of slavery is the antithesis of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Genesis Reddix is a leader among young African-American thinkers who are not breaking windows, vandalizing businesses, and shooting 8-year-old girls. Remember Sequoia Turner, please. Some of you might be feeling a little tingle in your toes right now. I told you we'd be make some people be stepping on some toes. We have young activists who know how to organize protests, vocalize their agenda, and stand erect when speaking truth to power. This old soul had to stop and listen as this young lady spoke. She was among a panel of historians and educators who engaged in a sensible discussion about the origin and the thought processes that made this statue to insurrection and inhumanity an eternal rallying point for racism, hypocrisy, and division. Those such as Ms. Reddick need more recognition and support. They are the ones being drowned out by the cacophony of hatred and ignorance that gets media attention but does little to extricate us from that cesspool called racism. We need more supporters of these champions of truth, civility, and equality. Otherwise, we stay stuck where we are. Now let's talk about that mountain as mentioned by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in his famous I Have a Dream speech. Far too many of you, Black, white, and in between, have been misled into thinking that the carvings on Stone Mountain are meant solely to celebrate the insurrectionists, also known as Confederate soldiers, who died trying to destroy this country. It is not. When you see the carvings on Stone Mountain, think of Bull Connor of Birmingham, Alabama, who in 1963 grinned as men, women, and children were subjected to dog attacks and high-pressured fire hoses simply because they asked to be treated as American citizens. When you hear the voices honoring the depictions of Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, also hear Alabama Governor George Wallace, who uttered the words written by a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. When you read words of support for the creation and the preservation of the carvings on Stone Mountain, think of the words of Georgia Governor, a Democrat, Samuel Marvin Griffin, in his campaign promise after the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in favor of Linda Brown in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Griffin, a supporter of segregation and in favor of completing the carvings on Stone Mountain, stated, "This last vestige of states' rights guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the Constitution is gone. This second reconstruction of the South is now underway." This was a clarion call to white supremacy in defiance of a ruling by the United States Supreme Court. This governor and his legislators believed the racist utterings of George Wallace were more important than this country's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governor Griffin, Governor Wallace, Sam Venable, who we spoke about earlier, the Ku Klux Klan, and even some of your current state and federal legislators boast of their rhetorical devotion to American ideals, but will ignore the preamble to the United States Constitution, which clearly states, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. How is celebrating warmongers who fought and died to maintain slavery and dissolution of this country congruent with the quest to form a more perfect union under God, with liberty and justice for all? Now, I expect that some of you are getting sore feet and turning this program off in order to watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Quod erat demonstratum, QED. Stone Mountain was purchased from Sam Venable, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, by the state of Georgia, not as a commemoration of Southern heritage. It was purchased as a representation of massive resistance to federally funded, federally mandated integration. Taxpayer money that included money from the descendants of slaves was used to celebrate those who wanted to maintain slavery and racial subjugation. This would be similar to Germany flying the Nazi flag outside of Jewish synagogues to celebrate those soldiers who murdered millions of Jews in support of Hitler's ethnic cleansing. By the way, the Nazi flag is banned in Germany, but is carried by our modern day insurrectionists along with their Confederate flags while wearing t-shirts emblazoned with the words Arbeit Mach Frei. Work makes you free. Those words greeted Jews destined for murder as they entered Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, and other German-managed death camps. But the battle flag of the first insurrection and its accompanying symbols, like Stone Mountain's carvings, remain with us today. The carving on the side of Stone Mountain is the largest Confederate monument in the world. The mountain is engraved with the sculpture of well-known leaders of the Confederacy: Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States, and Generals Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Many Georgians recognize the Stone Mountain carvings, but few know the full origin of this carving. The effort to create the Confederate monument on Stone Mountain began in the 1910s, and yet the monument was only completed in 1972. And right after it was completed, as I said earlier, the KKK decided they were going to hold a rally at the top of that mountain and burn a cross. In 1958, Governor Marvin Griffin signed into law a law authorizing the purchase of Stone Mountain from Samuel Venable. That law also adopted the Stone Mountain Memorial Association to oversee the completion of the carvings and govern the park. The carving was completed, as I said, in 1972. Now, as a reminder, Governor Marvin Griffin was an overt supporter of segregation, and he promised to resume the carvings if elected during his campaign for governor. Just terrible. He also supported legislation to change the Georgia state flag to one featuring the Confederate battle flag. Pro-segregation members of the government and community used Confederate symbolism, including Stone Mountain, to reassert the lost cause ideology and cling to their way of life. In other words, Confederate symbolism was invoked as a last effort thwarting federally mandated integration. From this controversial history rises an enormous tribute to the lost cause of the Confederacy and massive resistance to integration, only a few miles from Atlanta, GA. In 2001, Georgia Governor Roy Barnes began an effort to remove the Confederate battle emblem from the Georgia flag. One nation, under God, indivisible. That battle emblem represented an effort to destroy the nation and create one that accepted the inhumanity of slavery and racial subjugation as a normal way of life in the United States of America. As part of a compromise, the legislator amended the law, removing the battle emblem to include a provision to protect the carving on Stone Mountain and language to include the lost cause mythology. You cannot understand or appreciate the symbolism of Stone Mountain carving without knowing about the lost cause myth. A learning experience for me. The lost cause is an interpretation of the American Civil War, and I'm sure that some of you have heard this, that attempts to preserve the honor of the South by casting the Confederate defeat in the best possible light. It attributes the loss to the overwhelming Union advantage in manpower and resources. It celebrates pre-Civil War South of supposedly benevolent slave owners and contented enslaved people, and downplays or altogether ignores slavery as a cause of war. It became the philosophical foundation for the racial violence and terrorism employed to reverse Reconstruction and for the reimposition of white supremacy in the Jim Crow era. Its acceptance in the North, as well as in the South, perpetuated decades of denial of civil rights to African Americans. This is just a reminder, you are viewing and listening to WCEG Talk Radio, Issues and Answers. I am Norman A. Carter Jr., and the views expressed on this program are my own and not the views of WCEG management. Right about now, I'm going to take a small detour, but the path will lead right back to Stone Mountain. Several months ago, a candidate for election to represent Georgia as a legislator was interviewed by me on this program. This candidate vowed to push for legislation to increase Medicare for poor people. The candidate's focus was solely on African Americans. I asked if the candidate had ever carried this proposal to rural white Americans in Georgia. The response was a verbal deer in the headlights response. Like he never even thought about that. I have asked similar questions to several other candidates. None had the courage or forethought to take their proposals to a larger electorate, low income and unemployed white Americans. Numbers and votes count if you really want to get into office. Numbers and votes count. Doesn't matter whether the votes come from white folks or black folks. You need votes. But to sit there and say that I don't want to go in that neighborhood, that's all white. You got no guts, so how can you lead? Sorry. You cannot be serious about promoting any type of legislation without broadening your sphere of influence. You cannot be a congressperson or senator of blacks no more than we want a congressman or senator of whites. Yes, it happens. Yes, it's divisive. Yes, it's un-American. Yes, it does little to promote the general welfare as defined in our Constitution. Now let's get back to the mountain and its carvings. Yes, the Civil War was fought because some states wanted nothing to stand in the way of slavery. That is a fact. It is also a fact that these insurrectionists believed that dissolution of these United States of America was necessary in order to maintain a way of life that was malevolent and not benevolent. Southern pride, pay attention, folks. Southern pride, whenever you hear the term Southern pride, remember, Southern pride was dependent on rape, lynchings, and beatings, and overall inhumanity. That's Southern pride. But let's deal with the dissolution or destruction of the United States of America. If you are a patriot but have no qualms about slavery, how do you celebrate people who tried to destroy this country by allowing their statues and monuments to become venerated structures? How do you allow legislation to stand that protects an American aberration such as the carving on Stone Mountain to be maintained and preserved into perpetuity? That is what we have today. That's the law. That is why a movement to rid us of this stain on American history must have the support of not only Blacks, but every American citizen, regardless of race. The carving on Stone Mountain is not a Black problem. It's an American problem. We have to stop separating ourselves from issues that are for the common good. We are American. Act like an American. Talk to Americans, whether they're Black, whether they're white, talk to them. Get your point across. Get their support. Otherwise, you'll never get elected. You'll wind up on programs like WCEG spouting a bunch of nonsense, and you'll never get elected because you are myopic and you're only looking to cater to your buddies, your friends, people that look like you. That doesn't work. Let's clear the air for a minute. The sins of the father should not result in vitriol directed towards the children. Let me repeat that. The sins of the father should not result in vitriol directed towards the children. That is happening today. White Americans living today, whether or not their ancestors benefited from slavery, are neither guilty nor should they be punished for something they did not do. But those who overtly or tacitly support the maintaining of this tribute to man's inhumanity to man are guilty of celebrating that moment in time, and those who perverted the American dream both then and those who pervert it now. The carving on that mountain represents an allegiance to a disgusting part of American history. It represents a desire to return to old laws and old policies that are not in keeping with the promises America has made to all of its citizens without regard to race or where they live. That monument should neither be maintained nor protected. Several years ago, the members of my church thought it was a good idea to go to Stone Mountain Park. I told you about that earlier. It was a terrible idea. Terrible idea. First of all, I hate sitting on grass. And then you had this kid cracking the whip out there. That's a reflection not just on him, but it's a reflection on his family. And the fact that nobody got upset but me seemed to me that, okay, that was acceptance on the group that I was with, but it was also acceptance by the family, because the family said this is the way that it's supposed to be. I had to get out of there. One nation under God. We acknowledge governance by the God of Abraham and Isaac, a God of order, a God of respect, a God of humanity. The stone mountain carving epitomizes the guardians of disorder, inhumanity, and division. There was no godliness in their cause, in their actions, and there is no godliness in the celebration of their lives. People who supported honoring these men saw nothing wrong with lynching Leo Max Frank in 1915. Who was Leo Max Frank? He is another part of the history of Georgia. In the spring of 1913, Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old factory worker, was found murdered in the basement of the National Pencil Factory in Atlanta. Leo Frank, the superintendent of the factory, was accused of her murder. A Northerner and a Jew, Frank was swiftly convicted and sentenced to death. Now, there were several court appeals about the guilt and sentencing of Leo Frank. Facts began to emerge that indicated that Leo Frank was not the murderer. The murderer was likely his prime accuser. In 1915, the governor of Georgia commuted Frank's sentence to life in prison. But an outraged mob stormed the state penitentiary. They kidnapped Frank. Can you imagine? Kidnapped out of a prison and took him to Mary Fagan's hometown of Marietta, Georgia. On August 17th, they lynched him. Leo Frank was 31 years old. Just as they had done to blacks who tried to vote, this lynch mob proudly took pictures of their deed. No one was ever arrested for this lynching. Those pictures of that lynching are still with us to this very day. Racism and anti-Semitism are forbidden fruit from the tree of ignorance. The carving on Stone Mountain of Georgia is a salute to lynch mobs, slavery, and the quest to dissolve these United States of America. That carving is not just an insult to African Americans. It is an insult to all Americans who believe that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that these rights are to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People who supported honoring these heroes of the Confederacy saw nothing wrong with treating slaves worse than one would treat dogs. People who honor these heroes of insurrection ran through our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, with the flag of the insurrection, also known as the flag of the Confederacy, and shirts emblazoned with the words, Arbeit Mach Frei. Work makes you free. Should taxpayers pay for maintaining a monument to man's inhumanity to man? You are viewing and listening to WCEG Talk Radio's Issues and Answers. I am Norman A. Carter Jr., and the views expressed on this program are my own and not the views of WCEG management. The Gospel of John is noted as the most popular of all New Testament books. This fourth gospel, in retrospect, is often described as the most anti-Semitic of all the gospels. The three synoptic gospels blamed the disbelief that Jesus was the Messiah mainly on Jewish leadership, the Pharisees the scribes, and the Sadducees. But the book of John collectively reduced the Jews, I like to call them Yehudim because that's who they are, to an oppositional evil force throughout his gospel, utilizing the simple phrase, the Jews, throughout. This phrase appears 71 times in the gospel. That misalignment of Jewish people became the foundation of centuries of hatred and persecution of Jewish people. Now, because there was anger over the crucifixion of the anointed Son of God, also known as Jesus the Christ, but properly called Yeshua HaMashiach ben Elohim, blame was cast on the very people he was trying to help. I'm sorry, but most Christians avoid calling the author of their religion by his actual name. They rather use that made-up name. So be it. As a result, even certain religious leaders and sects refer to people of the Hebrew faith as Jesus killers. That misconception due to an inaccurate interpretation of scriptures served as justification for several pogroms in Russia and the Holocaust in Germany, where over 6 million Yehudim were murdered in an industrialized and callous manner. All forgot that Israel, also known as Palestine, was under siege by the Romans. The Romans set the rules. Historical books such as Josephus' Jewish Wars state that Pontius Pilate was a ruthless prefect trying to get himself promoted and sent to Rome. Killing someone who disrupted a Hebrew holy day would not be something he would lose sleep over. Yeshua Bar Yosef, as he was known by his family, friends, and enemies, we call him Jesus, was crucified for treason. That is a Roman crime, not a Jewish offense. Our biblical history verifies the fact that written on the top of his cross was the reason he was crucified. Yeshua, King of the Jews. Yet for nearly 2,000 years, church leaders vilified the wrong people. That is, people of the Hebrew faith. Hebrews did not whip Jesus. Hebrews did not nail him to the cross. Hebrews did not pierce him in his side with a spear. Evil tongues emanating from Christian pulpits of the world blamed the wrong people, persecuting and blaming Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus began to subside after the Second Vatican Council held in 1962 to 1965. The Roman Catholic Church under Pope Paul VI repudiated the belief of collective Jewish guilt for the crucifixion of Jesus. In the year 2000, Pope Paul II, John Paul II, against the advice of many of his advisors, issued an encyclical which contained an apology for the Catholic Church's role in either ignoring or participating in the persecution of Jews, Yehudim, because of the crucifixion of Yeshua Bar Yosef, Jesus. When you have the time, you can read about the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, and the Russian anti-Hebrew pogroms. The Roman Catholic Church does not bear total blame, but they were the first to proclaim to the world that they regretted their role in the misapplication of biblical history. Other Christian groups and sects were equally guilty of the verbal poison responsible for the murder of millions of people of Hebrew faith. That verbal poison continues to this day. Preachers and church leaders ignore the fact that first century Jewish leaders did not have the power to crucify anyone. That was a Roman punishment for treason and other crimes. I mention this because when it comes to anti-Semitism, our Christian churches bear a lot of the blame. As Easter approaches, how many pulpits are manned by preachers ordained in ignorance who have never picked up to read a book about any historical book about Herodian rule, Roman domination, or Jewish customs and protocol? They conveniently ignore that Jesus was a practicing Jew until he died. He was buried, a Jew. His resurrection was certified by his Jewish disciples. Jesus did not die a Christian. He died a Jew. But ignorance persists. Anti-Semitism is proliferating, and it all begins with teachings in churches and cathedrals. Now, Jesus' brother, Jacob, also known as James, put it this way: not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, since you know that we will receive a stricter judgment. End quote. Therefore, continue preaching and teaching a lie may make you popular with men, but very unpopular with God. Before you step behind a pulpit, get educated. Don't become a conduit of evil. Jews did not kill Jesus, nor did they demand the death of anyone from such a brutal tyrant as Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate hated Jews, not some Jews, but all Jews. Read your history. Otherwise, you are as guilty of anti-Semitism as the Ku Klux Klan, Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Putin, or Joseph Stalin. This brings me back to Leo Max Frank, who was lynched by an anti-Semitic mob after being falsely accused of murder. Georgia, a state which tacitly accepted lynching of an innocent Jewish male, now has difficulty in codifying into law protection from hate crimes directed towards Jews because it cannot define the word anti-Semitism. This is feigned ignorance. It comes from the same legislature that has made the Stone Mountain mural a venerated object. That mural has been and still is a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan and others of their ilk. And for those of you who are unaware of the history of the Klan, allow me to inform you that this most virulent group hates Jews as much as it hates Black Americans and any other culture that it considers non-white. The lost cause myth is their reality. Former President Donald Trump's senior counselor coined the phrase alternative facts. That phrase fits the world in which the Ku Klux Klan lives, in which the benefactors and protectors of the Stone Mountain carving lived, and the world in which those who believe in the lost cause live. Now, why is that dangerous and why is it relevant? During the week of March 17, 2023, just last week, former President Donald Trump, who is facing multiple indictments from multiple jurisdictions, sent out a veiled threat to the lives of 2 district attorneys, both of whom are African American. To them, he stated, "If I am charged, it will bring death and destruction." He made no such threats to the special counsel, who is white, who may seek to indict him for violation of federal laws related to the insurrection of 2021. On Saturday, March 25th in Waco, Texas, the national hotbed of racism and malignant nationalism, Trump held a rally for his 2024 run for the presidency. There he spoke of 2024 1944 as being, quote, the final battle, end quote. He further stated that, quote, either the deep states will destroy America or we will destroy the deep states, end quote. The lunatic fringe of his constituency, many of whom claim to be evangelicals, will take this as a directive to support him with violence directed toward anyone who challenges Trump in an election or who seeks to imprison him for crimes. This is a directive for another civil war. This is not hyperbole. His bellicose speeches after losing the election in 2020 directly led to the insurrection of 2021, where his supporters attempted to kill certain congresspersons, senators, and even the vice president of the United States. Oh, how quickly we minimize and forget. Remember Southern pride fanatic John Wilkes Booth? It's time for America to stop being apathetic and sometimes just plain stupid. Voting is important. Be an educated voter. Stupid voting nearly made Herschel Walker our senator. Voter apathy allowed Donald Trump to become president. Trump not only gave rise to increased nationalism and racism, his mocking COVID-19 was dangerous. Remember, in January of 2020, he stated the disease would be over in April as soon as it gets warm. Remember, he mocked COVID-19 vaccine during his campaign, and two of his biggest supporters, Herman Cain and a preacher, both African-American, died because of it. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died because Trump felt the vaccine was unimportant. Still, he maintains support from an electorate that is deaf, dumb, and blind, but dangerous. They are sheep, and Trump is their shepherd. But unlike real sheep, these devotees are as violent as they are ignorant. They carry the flag of the Confederacy as if it is the new battle flag. It is they for whom the carving on Stone Mountain exists. Just as their Civil War predecessors, they are focused on destroying this country. They seek to make the United States Congress and the United States Senate function as the State Duma and the Federal Council of Russia. These emasculated officials do nothing more than approve any mandate that comes from the president. It's time for compassionate leadership, steeped in the belief that symbols of slavery, racial subjugation, and genocide must be removed, not only in Georgia, but nationwide. That would begin with Stone Mountain. Does any legislator have the courage to put forth legislation to end the perpetual maintenance of Stone Mountain's carving? That law protects it must be rescinded. We have the means to remove it and establish Georgia as a forward-thinking state and appreciative of the American dream and not the goals of those who sought to destroy both the country and that dream. We must honor those who believe in one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Otherwise, we will be a country mired in hypocrisy and division. But that is exactly what some people want. And many of them are our present elected officials. I encourage everyone who lives in or visits metropolitan Atlanta to visit the Atlanta History Center, as well as the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Museum in Atlanta. If you cannot come to Atlanta, spend a day or two both at the Holocaust Museum and the National Museum of African American history and culture in Washington, D.C. Knowledge is power. That power can and will defeat the malignancy of racism and anti-Semitism that has inflicted so much death and harm to millions in this country. We are America. We are one. We must love our neighbor as we love ourselves. May we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. This is Issues and Answers on the WCEG Network. I thank you for your viewing, your support, and your quest for understanding our history, our neighbors, our past, and our future. With all thy getting, get understanding. Thank you, and good day.